He believed that she was merely another black woman whom he could intimidate, until she entered the courtroom and ended his career. That evening, the roadway was virtually deserted. A few automobiles passed by, their headlights reflecting off the damp pavement. Long shadows were cast over the stretch of highway outside Birmingham, Alabama, as the streetlights wavered. It was past 11 p.m., a time when the majority of individuals were eager to return home. After nearly 2 hours of driving, Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson's fingers were lightly drumming against the wheel, and she was humming along to the gentle cadence of an old jazz tune that was playing through the speakers. She was not dressed in a uniform, she was wearing a black jumper and trousers, with her hair tied back. She did not distinguish herself. Or so she believed. Next, she observed the lights in her rearview mirror, which were flickering and rapidly approaching her. The lights were red and blue. She clutched her stomach, not out of fear, she was aware of the outcome, but rather out of exhaustion. She signaled, changed lanes, and gently steered her vehicle onto the shoulder. She parked the vehicle, exhaled slowly, and maintained her hands in a visible position. She was well versed in the exercise, as she had served in the military for an extended period. A white patrol vehicle halted in close proximity to her. The officer took his time exiting the building. He moved with the grace of a man who anticipated obedience when he finally did, one hand resting on his belt, the other holding a torch that flickered on as he approached. His heavy boots scuffed against the asphalt. She tilted her head slightly and observed him through the side mirror. The light was attracted to the name on his insignia. Briggs. License and registration. There is no salutation. There is no explanation. His voice was impatient, rehearsed, and flat. Renee gazed into the mirror and then slowly reached into the glove compartment, extracting her documents. She inquired, "Officer, was I exceeding the speed limit?" Her voice was composed. Briggs did not respond immediately. He removed the documents from her hand, retaining them just out of reach as he conducted a thorough inspection of her vehicle. He stated, "The taillight is out." She made a scowl. "That can't be right." Briggs finally turned to her. "Are you arguing with me?" Silence fell for a moment. Renee could sense the change in the air, that quiet, unspoken instant when power met resistance, and one side anticipated the other's surrender. She had previously observed it in briefings, on bases overseas, and in training exercises designed to equip sailors for the world beyond the Navy. She was aware that it was unwise to exert pressure. However, she was also aware of her privileges. She responded with a composed voice, "I am merely expressing my opinion. My taillights were checked a few weeks ago. But if there's an issue, I can get it fixed. Step out of the car." Briggs interrupted her abruptly, as if he had not heard a word. Renee gradually inhaled. She cast an eye towards the traffic that lay ahead. No eyewitnesses. Once, she tapped her fingertips against the steering wheel before reaching for the door handle. She inquired, "Would you be willing to provide me with an explanation?" Briggs smirked as he inclined his head. "Because I said so." She allowed that to remain suspended for a moment. Then, she pushed the door open after unbuckling her seatbelt. She was surprised by the lower temperature of the night air. She stepped onto the pavement with a relaxed yet measured demeanor. She was not seeking a confrontation, however, she would not tolerate bullying. Briggs took a rearward stride, examining her. She could sense him assessing her, determining the extent to which he could exploit her. "Turn around. Hands on the car." This time, she hesitated. "For what reason?" Briggs advanced in his approach. His grin dissipated. "Are you resisting?" Renee maintained her position. "No. I'm asking a question." Something flickered across his face, possibly a combination of amusement and irritation. Then, without any advance notice, he reached for his radio. He murmured into the speaker, "We have a non-compliant driver here." Afterward, the volume increased. "Turn around." Her pulse increased, but her demeanor remained unchanged. She spoke softly but firmly, "Officer, I require your comprehension of a matter. I know exactly what I'm allowed to do. And I know exactly what you can't do." Briggs was not fond of that. His mandible contracted. "You are being arrested," he abruptly stated, reaching for her wrist. Before he could seize her, Renee retreated just enough to evade his grasp. "Under arrest for what?" Briggs removed his wristbands. "For obstructing an officer." She abruptly exhaled through her nostrils. Therefore, that was his pastime. Her military training was evident, her breathing was consistent, her heartbeat remained stable. She was aware that she had two options, either comply and combat the situation at a later time, or resist and risk escalation. She was determined not to become yet another statistic. She turned with deliberate, unhurried movements, placing her hands on the roof of her vehicle. The metal was chilly against her hands. Briggs promptly yanked her arms behind her back, causing the cuffs to be overly tightened, and then pushed her towards the patrol vehicle. She whispered, "You are unaware of your actions." Briggs chuckled and pushed her into the back seat. "Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing." However, he refrained from doing so. Not even close. The patrol car's hard plastic upholstery penetrated her back. Renee's respiration was measured as she sat still, her wrists burning against the cuffs. The door slammed shut behind her, enclosing her. Briggs mumbled something into his radio as he strode back to his vehicle. She briefly examined the partition that separated her from the front seat. She gazed back at the faint reflection of her visage, which was composed and tranquil. However, there was a simmering sensation beneath that. She had participated in high-stakes operations, combat exercises, and interrogations in foreign countries. However, this was distinct. This was a man who was persuaded that he was untouchable, drunk on power, and possessed a badge. A few minutes elapsed. Then, 5. Then, 10. She tested the cuffs by slightly shifting her wrists. Far too restrictive. He had intentionally committed the act. Briggs slid into the vehicle, whistling, as the driver's side door opened. Well, he murmured, securing his seatbelt across his chest. "Let's take a little ride." She refrained from responding. He engaged the gearbox, exiting the verge and returning to the roadway. The overhead lights continued to blaze as the patrol car accelerated. The road behind them was stained by the red and blue reflections in the side mirrors, which she could observe. "You know," Briggs said after a brief pause, "the majority of individuals simply remain silent when I instruct them to leave." Renee abruptly exhaled through her nostrils. "And most officers don't arrest people for questioning a traffic stop." Briggs chuckled and shook his head. "Lady, you must really think you're somebody." She gazed at him through the glass. "I don't think. I know." As a result, he briefly hesitated. His arrogant exterior was interrupted by a flicker of irritation as his knuckles flexed around the wheel. However, he promptly concealed the incident. He inquired, "Are you a member of the military?" His demeanor abruptly changed. She declined to respond. "Yes, I anticipated," he continued. "You got that attitude, that above-the-law type." He smirked. "Bet you thought I'd back off if you threw that around, huh?" Nevertheless, she maintained her silence. Briggs' tongue was clipped. "Shame," he contemplated, shaking his head. "If you'd just kept your mouth shut, we could have avoided all this." Her mandible contracted. The audacity of it, as if his actions were somehow her fault. Up ahead, the station was visible, a gray brick structure that was compact and situated just off the main road. The parking lot was primarily devoid of vehicles. The late-night processing was sluggish, and it appeared that she was the sole guest at this time. Briggs parked in a designated area near the entrance, deactivated the engine, and then turned to observe her through the partition. He murmured, "I do love it when they make it easy." He exited the vehicle before she could respond, closing the door behind him. A mere second later, her door flung open. He issued the command, "Let's depart." She slightly twisted her forearms as she exited the building. The shackles penetrated her skin, he had not adjusted them in any way. She maintained her head held high as he guided her through the building, passing a desk sergeant who appeared disinterested, and into the processing area. The holding area was characterized by the aroma of old coffee and perspiration. The far wall was adorned with a metal bench, and a steel door led to the cells immediately beyond it. Briggs briefly released her handcuffs to facilitate her filing. The entire procedure, including fingerprints and mugshots. The officers behind the desk were oblivious to their surroundings, merely performing their duties. She had previously observed this type of indifference. This was the type of environment that enabled harmful individuals such as Briggs to flourish. Upon its conclusion, he again grasped her wrist, directing her towards the cells. He murmured, "You believe you are intelligent, don't you?" She cast a sideways gaze. "I don't have to think." His grasp became increasingly rigid. She recognized that it caused him to become irritated. "Enjoy your stay," Briggs sneered, pushing her towards the cell. Before she could begin to stumble, Renee managed to catch herself. She swiveled, observing the metal bars as they closed between them. Briggs smirked from the opposite side and lightly touched the bars with his fingertips before departing. Locked into position, the mechanism chimed. She sank onto the bench after taking a slow breath. She was grounded by the metal's coolness, which penetrated her jeans. One night is all that is required. Because Briggs was unaware of the individual with whom he had entered into an altercation. The metal bench was hard, frigid, and unforgiving. Renee slightly moved, rolling her shoulders to alleviate the stiffness that was edging in. The cell was modest in size, consisting of 4 walls, a single flickering lamp, and the faint aroma of disinfectant and old sweat. She had endured evenings in significantly more dreadful circumstances, where the threat was not merely discomforting but actually lethal. What is this? This was of no consequence. However, this did not imply that she was not enraged. She could hear the faint murmur of officers conversing at the front desk through the bars. Occasionally, documentation is shuffled. The sound of a coffee cup striking a desk. She exhaled slowly and steadily. Manage your respiration, manage your thoughts. She was subjected to fundamental instruction prior to her arrival at the fleet. Subsequently, there was substantial footfall. Briggs. Before he even appeared, she was aware that it was him. His stride was characterized by the same arrogant rhythm, as if he believed himself to be impenetrable. A second later, he materialized in front of the cell, his arms crossed over his chest, and his face was adorned with the same smug grin. Comfy? She declined to respond. He stepped closer to the bars as he inclined his head. You know, if you just played along, you wouldn't be in here right now. She allowed a gradual smile to curl at the corners of her mouth. Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be. Briggs's grin faltered for a brief moment, as if there was a flicker of something in his gaze. Unpleasant. Uncertainty. As he peered towards the empty holding area, he quickly covered it, scoffing. There will be no one to retrieve you tonight, lady, he replied with a shrug. Guess that means you'll have some time to think about that attitude. Renee was merely observing him. Unmoved. Unconcerned. Briggs leaned in slightly. Indeed, this is the issue, he continued, his voice ebbing. People like you think the rules don't apply. You think a little confidence is enough to get out of trouble. She permitted him to converse. Allow him to meander. It was of no consequence. Because he was unaware of the impending events. Then, as if on cue, an additional officer emerged from the hallway. A youthful individual, likely in his late 20s, who was attired in a standard-issue uniform. While holding a clipboard, he halted a few feet away. Sergeant? There was a faint undercurrent of uncertainty in the officer's voice. The officer hesitated, shifting on his feet, as Briggs barely glanced at him. I think you need to see this. Briggs frowned and then gave Renee one final glance before departing. She reclined and listened. The discussion was hushed, but she managed to discern a few tidbits, questions regarding her detention, a call from a higher-up, and a possible counsel. Briggs's voice became more irritated and pointed as it descended. In response, the junior officer stammered something, however, it did not appear to bring him any feelings of satisfaction. Then, one more set of heavy footfall. Briggs returned with a resolute expression, his jaw clenched and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His grin had vanished. What the hell did you do? Renee's elbows were resting on her legs as she leaned forward. I did not take any action. She inclined her head slightly. But people talk. And some of us have friends in very high places. The color of Briggs's visage darkened. It was now apparent to her, that moment of realization was beginning to arrive. The change in authority. He was no longer in charge. After murmuring something under his breath, he turned on his heel and vanished down the hallway. Renee inhaled. It will not be a long time. Briggs would regret each and every decision that had brought him to this point when the truth was revealed. The polished floors were illuminated by the light that filtered through the courthouse's narrow windows, resulting in lengthy streaks. The interior was characterized by a brisk, icy air that would penetrate your bones if you remained seated for an extended period. Renee's eyes were alert, but her posture was relaxed as she stood in close proximity to the defendant's table. She was no longer restrained by shackles. No orange garb. There is no detention cell. A basic blouse, a well-tailored navy blue blazer, and an undeniable presence. She was not alone. As individuals entered the courtroom, Carla Whitman, her attorney, perused a stack of documents in close proximity to her. The woman was highly effective. Methodical. There are no unnecessary movements. There will be no small chatter. Renee appreciated that. The heavy wooden doors at the rear of the courtroom swung open. Briggs entered the room. He maintained an air of authority in the room, with his shoulders erect and his jaw slightly elevated. But there was a distinction now. A rigidity in his gait. A momentary glimmer of something in his demeanor that had not been present previously. He was no longer as confident in his abilities. His attention was drawn to Renee. He averted his gaze. All right. The judge entered the room, and the atmosphere became more tranquil. Judge Alan Kirkland, an elderly man with a sagging countenance, adjusted his spectacles as he acclimatized. He did not squander his time. He sighed and glanced at the case files. "All right," he said. "Let's get to it." The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with precisely combed hair, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe that the defendant, Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson, was unlawfully detained without probable cause. Furthermore, new information suggests a pattern of misconduct involving the arresting officer, Sergeant Daniel Briggs." Within the chamber, there was a gentle murmur. Briggs' mandible tightened as he shifted in his seat. Over his spectacles, the judge observed him. "Sergeant Briggs, would you be willing to elaborate?" Briggs cleared his larynx as he leaned forward. "Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop." He was abruptly interrupted by the prosecutor. "Uncooperative?" He turned and lifted a document from the table. "Lieutenant Commander Dawson's military career is characterized by distinction. Naval Academy graduate. Numerous accolades. No criminal record. There are no outstanding citations. Are you informing me that, in spite of all of this, she posed such a threat that you were compelled to apprehend her for a damaged taillight?" Briggs initially opened his mouth, but subsequently closed it. The silence was prolonged. The prosecutor continued to peruse his documents. "In addition, an internal examination of your arrest history indicates that there is a disproportionate number of traffic stops involving black drivers in this district." The volume of the murmurs increased. Briggs's complexion darkened. With an exhale, Judge Kirkland placed his file on the table. "Sergeant, I am not fond of the information I am receiving." Briggs reclined, his arms crossed. "She resisted." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "The body camera footage contradicts this assertion." The room was affected by an additional sonic wave. Briggs abruptly became more defensive as she gazed at the judge. "I was adhering to the established protocol." Judge Kirkland rejected the argument. He briefly observed the bailiff. "The footage should be viewed." A screen was lowered at the front of the tribunal. A video commenced to be viewed. Renee did not turn to observe, she had experienced it firsthand. Briggs shouting orders. Her speech was composed. The unwarranted escalation. The arrogant manner in which he tightened the cuffs. The footage concluded with an absolute silence in the room. The fingertips of Judge Kirkland were steepled as he leaned forward. "Sergeant Briggs, you violated protocol, conducted an unlawful arrest, and neglected to provide the complete details in your initial statement." Briggs began to speak, however, the judge was not yet finished. "The charges against Lieutenant Commander Dawson are hereby dismissed." His gavel fell with a sharp and definitive sound. "I also strongly recommend that an internal investigation be conducted into Sergeant Briggs's actions." The room's tension was disrupted in a manner reminiscent of a rubber band being tugged. Briggs appeared to have been struck in the abdomen. His face was flushed and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Renee exhaled slowly and deliberately. She was never uncertain. She cast one final glimpse at Briggs as she stood, gathering her possessions. Their gaze intersected. No words were exchanged. It was unnecessary for them to be so. This time, she was not the one who was required to defend her reputation. Briggs was. With his heavy footsteps echoing down the polished corridors, Briggs stormed out of the courtroom. His jaw was clenched, and his visage was tense. He could sense the gaze of other officers, court personnel, and even reporters who had arrived after the case had gained attention. He was not accustomed to this. He was accustomed to exercising control, to entering a room and invoking either fear or respect. However, the authority that he had previously taken for granted now seemed to be evaporating from his grasp. Then, the most distressing aspect occurred. "Sergeant Briggs." The hallway commotion was interrupted by a sharp voice. He pivoted. The expression of Chief Eldon Baker was inscrutable as he stood with his arms crossed. The senior officer, who had served for more than 3 decades, was a highly esteemed member of the department. His words were significant. "Straighten Briggs." "Sir." Baker briefly examined him before gestured for Briggs to follow him into a private office with a brusque nod. The chief's demeanor deteriorated immediately upon the door closing. "What were you thinking?" Briggs abruptly exhaled. "I was performing my duties." "What is your occupation?" Baker sneered and threw a file onto the desk. The object struck the ground with a forceful impact. "That is not the appearance from this vantage point. The arrest history, the body camera footage, and the fact that you were unaware of the individual you were apprehending." Briggs's nostrils elongated. "How does that relate to anything?" Baker leaned forward. "Everything." His voice was subdued yet incisive. "This was not an arbitrary woman. This individual was a senior member of the Navy. Do you believe that this will simply vanish?" Briggs gazed away, his teeth clenching. She exhibited a lack of respect. Baker interjected, she made inquiries about you. That is not a criminal offense. Briggs shook his head and sneered. You are not understanding it. Individuals of that nature, the chief's demeanor became more stern. What do individuals prefer? Briggs's silence was damning. Baker exhaled and rubbed his forehead. The district attorney is evaluating each and every one of your cases from the previous 5 years. Racial profiling has been detected. Additionally, you can be assured that this department will not be joining you in your downfall. The twisting of Briggs' midsection was palpable. What is the significance of that? Baker adjusted his posture. It indicates that you are commencing an immediate suspension. He shook his head. Internal Affairs is conducting an investigation, and if they discover what I anticipate, they will. Your professional life has concluded. Briggs was struck by the words like a blow to the stomach. His visage was scorched. This is nonsense. Baker extended his hand. Please refrain from concluding that sentence. His tone was cold. Assemble your workstation. Additionally, I would seek legal counsel if I were you. Briggs stood there, his world unraveling in real time, his fists at his sides. For the first time in his professional life, he came to the realization that he was not impenetrable. Renee sat in a tranquil cafe across town, scrolling through her phone while she stirred a cup of coffee. Headlines regarding the case had already been reported. The video had gone viral. Lieutenant Commander wrongfully arrested. Officer under investigation. She was unsurprised. She was aware of the outcome from the moment she exited her vehicle that evening. She had encountered individuals such as Briggs that were entitled, arrogant, and accustomed to manipulating the law to their advantage. However, this time, he was unsuccessful. She received a notification from her counsel when her phone vibrated. Briggs has been suspended. Might face charges. Renee sipped her coffee slowly. All right. She observed the metropolis as it sped by, gazing out the window. The conflict was not concluded, not for her, nor for the individuals Briggs had presumably injured in the past. However, what about today? Today was a triumph. Renee emerged from the cafe to the aroma of freshly fallen raindrops in the cool afternoon air. Her shoulders should have been burdened by the weight of the prior 24 hours. However, this was not the case. She maintained the same level of assurance as she had always possessed, maintaining a constant pace and holding her head high. Her telephone rang once more. The number was one she recognized this time. She exhaled before responding. Captain. Lieutenant Commander, the voice that was so familiar to her greeted her. I assume you've seen the news? I have. A fleeting period of silence. At that time, and how are you feeling? Renee observed her reflection in a shop front window that was in close proximity. She observed no indications of defeat or deterioration in her composure. I feel like I did exactly what I was supposed to do, she asserted. The captain's tone became warmer. That's what I thought you'd say. A moment of silence. The Department of Defense has taken interest in your case. Don't be surprised if they ask you to speak on it. Renee exhaled through her nostrils. Not sure I'm interested in being a headline. The commander responded, you are already. And whether you like it or not, what happened to you is a reflection of something bigger. She was aware of this. She had always been aware. Briggs was not an anomaly. He was a member of a system that had permitted officers such as himself to operate without oversight for an extended period of time. This was not solely about her. It was about the dozens, possibly even hundreds, of individuals who had been in her position but lacked the rank, legal team, or voice to resist. Renee observed the traffic as she leaned against a streetlight. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, according to her. And it won't be the last. No, concurred the commander. But it's the first time Briggs is facing consequences. And it's because you didn't back down. Renee briefly closed her eyes to allow the words to sink in. She refused to yield. Not at the time Briggs pulled her over. Not when he attempted to intimidate her. This was not the case when the shackles were tightened around her wrists. No, not even when she was incarcerated for the night, fully aware that the odds were piled against her. She maintained a determined stance. What is the current situation? She had emerged victorious. The commander cleared his throat. One final item, he concluded. You might be getting a call from the mayor's office. Renee raised her eyebrows. Oh? Seems they want to recognize you for handling the situation with professionalism and grace. She grinned. Now that's ironic. The skipper laughed. You gonna accept it? Renee contemplated for a brief period before deciding to shrug. I'll think about it. She terminated the conversation and reinserted her phone into her pocket. A mother was walking with her young son across the street, his small hand securely wrapped around hers. He was laughing about something carefree and full of vitality. Renee observed them for a brief period. The subsequent generation. Indeed, she had advocated for herself. Nevertheless, she had persevered in his defense. For every black boy and girl who deserved to grow up in a world where men like Briggs were unable to wield their insignia like weapons. She exhaled deeply. Then, she turned and departed. Her strides are unwavering. Her objective is evident. Because this conflict was not solely hers. It was never the case. Power that is not checked is power that is abused. The sole method of altering the system is to ensure its accountability. Renee's ordeal is a daily occurrence for individuals who lack the privilege of rank, connections, or evidence to support their claims. That is why it is crucial to speak up. Requirement for modification. To refuse to remain mute. Share this narrative if it provoked thought. If it caused you to become enraged, discuss it. Additionally, if it has prompted you to recognize the substantial amount of work that remains, it is important to remain engaged. Real change commences with genuine discussions.